Welcome back to Modern Learning on the Air. Today, we're getting into a question that every L&D team thinks it has answered, but the data says otherwise. Does anyone actually know if their training works? My guest today wrote the research. Dr. Chip Dye is InSync's director of research, and he just led a study of 200 evaluation practitioners across different industries. And the results aren't very pretty. 83% of them say that their own data doesn't answer business questions that actually matter. And 73% can't tell you how their findings actually influence a decision. Chip has spent his career in program evaluation, a naval officer, a certification authority, program administrator, and he's going to walk us through what's broken and why even sophisticated organizations stall out and what a better approach actually looks like. So Chip, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Jeff.
All right, let's get right into it. The Acme the rocket story you open the report with, an old friend's line about why Acme actually runs training. Why did that stick with you enough to build the entire forward around it?
Well, it stuck with me because I looked around the room, and in that room were roughly 30 senior executives in the aerospace industry. And just the cost of getting those individuals there for 2 weeks and running the program and removing them from their particular roles, not to mention the cost of actually putting on the training, but the organizational impact of doing that was very costly to the company. And it made me think about what the real value and what the company was trying to accomplish by holding that training intervention. And I always kind of come back to that when I start thinking about program evaluation within the domain of learning and development.
Okay. All right. Well, so 83% of practitioners say their evaluations data doesn't answer real business questions. And then the 73% say they can't say how their findings influence management decisions. When you saw those numbers, what was your reaction?
What it told me is that someone that is not involved with actually achieving a particular organizational outcome has given any time to drawing a line between what the training is being delivered for and what they expect to happen as a consequence of the training. And so these practitioners in these companies are being asked to provide data. Very often the data is given to them, or the data reporting protocol is given to them about what to report, how to report it, etc. And the data gets pushed up. And the practitioners really feel that the data they're providing doesn't tell the story they think it should be telling. And and that's important in the context of program evaluation because you start with the latter. You start with what is the desired outcome, and you work backwards to decide what to collect. And what is particularly pernicious about return on investment discussions and benchmarks and key performance indicator kind of discussions are that those discussions lend themselves to really what is directly measurable in the moment right now because it's quote unquote hard data. The problem is that no one, for all those, vast majority of practitioners feel like the data that could be collected isn't. And as a consequence, they can't tell the story they.
All right. So let me follow up on that. Those two stats together are almost a closed loop. Bad data feeding decisions that nobody can trace. Which one do you think is cause? Which one is the cause and which one is the effect?
They're implemented at the same time. As soon as you have your first training delivery and you've measured the wrong stuff, you report the things that you're directed to report, and someone is making a decision about to proceed or change or reinstitute a new training intervention based on that data, but it might not be the data they should have been measuring. Now, this is not to say that a lot of companies, Jeff, aren't measuring a lot of very important data. They are. But there's a lot of other things that could be measured if the program evaluation approach had taken the time to really think about what the organizational outcome is desired from that training and then measure those things too.
All right. So that kind of leads me into my next question then. The blindfolded darts line, you wrote most organizations are throwing expensive darts with a blindfold on. Is that a training problem, a measurement problem, or something more structural in how L&D is positioned inside a company?
Think it's certainly structural, and as a matter of practice, I think that no one in those organizations where they're not taking advantage of the data they could be, no one has taken the time to think about, well, I'm supposed to be improving, for example, sales efficacy. What things could I measure in sales that might feed back to giving me insight into how my training is operating? That's not to say that companies aren't, like, for example, measuring training outcomes in meaningful ways, but it they're not looking deep enough to see what are the organizational metrics that I might be able to collect. So when I came up with that line about throwing darts blindfolded, no one again has drawn a strong dark line between a short term, medium term, or long term organizational outcome and the training intervention that we're expecting to precipitate those changes. They just want that change. They measure things like convening time and attendance and perhaps some kind of assessment on an individual basis. But, even companies that are measuring kind of longer term outcomes, like certification outcomes for training, if in a highly regulated environment, like a bar exam pass rate or what have you, very rarely are they taking that data and going back and identifying where their training program accomplishes or doesn't accomplish something troubling in that data. The hard lines aren't being drawn. So they're spending money on training and they want an outcome, but there's no way to know if it's achieving that outcome. And I'll give you a hypothetical that to kind of flesh that out. If I have some kind of sales training program and I say my organizational goal is to enhance sales performance, increase sales by 10%, say, by training them on this new product, giving them some new methodology, whatever it might be. Maybe it's using Salesforce. I mean, who knows? That's kind of where their analysis ends. They say, okay, now I can measure sales and see if the training accomplished that. But what if the economy got really hot or really cold in the time frame that we're selling? What if there's a process problem that prevents the sales from occurring instead of a knowledge problem? What if there's an organizational change or a technology change that impedes the accomplishment of the sales goal? You don't know because you haven't measured those things. Now, I'm not suggesting you go out and measure the economy, but at least identify it as something exterior to the organization that may affect your organizational outcome and then contemplate it when you evaluate it. But they're not doing that. They're just saying, is sales going up because we did this Salesforce training? And that's an incomplete picture.
Well, okay, so following up on that, if it's structural, is that fixable from within the L&D function, or does it require someone above L&D to change what they're asking?
So that's a very insightful question because most evaluation practitioners, like most L&D practitioners, feel like a lot of their stuff is kind of given to them and they're told what to do, as opposed to being part of the solution development. And that's kind of why I went back in the report and talk about what is a better way to approach that. And the short answer to your question is it can be accomplished within L&D. You can, as a practitioner evaluating training, think about the larger scale logic of how your training intervention fits into this organizational goal. This Acme rocket desire to do X. Why are they having all their execs sitting in a room for 2 weeks? And work backwards and decide what to measure and go out and measure it. Most data sources are within the organization accessible upon asking. And if you ask for it and then include that in your data in a meaningful way with some logic behind why you're including it and why it's important, it tells a more complete story. And so imagine pushing up that supplemental report instead of the standard one that's always been submitted. And now the person making decisions within the training organization or in this more senior, broader executive function can say, oh, yeah, of course sales is up because the economy's hot. Maybe some of it's attributable to the training. Let's look deeper. Or alternatively, the sales training wasn't effective because sales didn't move. Well, sales didn't move because our sales process is broken, as an example. So again, this isn't a hard and fast thing, but what I encourage evaluation practitioners to do in program evaluation is to kind of be prescriptive and proactive about going out and finding any relevant data that is pretty easy to access to bring into your evaluation model, and then decide, now that you've got kind of the formative evaluation plan, how you might use that data. And if it's irrelevant, discard it and don't collect it anymore. That happens some too. But in many cases, what people find is, the reason the sales on it hasn't gone up is we had a 20% personnel reduction in the department. So people don't have the time to do as much sales as they did because we don't have that many man hours. So, I would suggest that people listen to this podcast or that read the report kind of think about their own practice and how they might go find those other data sources.
Well, that kind of leads me to the next question then, because even among organizations already using Kirkpatrick or Phillips ROI, only 1 in 8 pushed the data to look at organizational impact. Why do you think even the sophisticated evaluators stall out there?
Yeah, I think in large part it's because either the data is pigeonholed and kind of siloed such that they can't get to it. That's typically uncommon with the kind of money that most organizations are spending on training, though. If I'm spending, you know, several $1,000,000 on training interventions a year, keeping my workforce up to date and productive, why can't I have that data again? It's a hard argument to make. I think the bigger problem is that even amongst program evaluators, there's disagreement about how much to rely on any particular data source and should I use that data for this purpose or that purpose when that wasn't its intention. And that's a very reasonable, you know, question. It goes to a question of validity. Are we using the data for the purpose for which it's intended? And that's why in the report, I suggest you go back, engage all those data sources before you even implement the training and say, this is what I'm going to do. And then talk to the decision makers and the stakeholders and say, is this okay? And that's going to generate opinion, right? No one's going to just say, oh, sure, go ahead. They might, but chances are they'll have opinions. And then it's a matter of back and forth to come up with a good solution that meets everyone's requirements. When I look at a small majority, 1 in 8 are looking at cross-organizational outcomes and then integrating that into their evaluation plan, that's concerning to me. Now, the data was kind of nuanced because if I just unpacked the response, do you look at organizational outcomes? The number is much higher than that, somewhere around 65%, about 2/3. But if I say, do you do the following things to include your organizational outcomes in your evaluation plan? That's when they go quiet because models like Phillips ROI or Kirkpatrick, they talk a lot about organizational outcomes. So everyone's got that message. Okay, I've got to look at organizations, Kirkpatrick, originally it was level 3 and level 4. But to actually do that in a meaningful way is where people fall down because it's hard. You have to think about that data, go find it, and then include it and integrate it in a meaningful way in your data model. And quite frankly, it's a tough road if you're the only person trying to push that. Now, that's another benefit, by the way, of bringing in leadership in in deciding how you're going to evaluate the training before it actually happens. Because if they buy into it, then they expect to see it. And as a consequence, when you spring on them, sales went up by 12%, but if you had made a change to sales process, it would have gone up 24 or 30%. That you're going to get someone's attention with that kind of state. Now, I'm speaking in very broad terms about a hypothetical situation, but the idea is you provide more contextual data about the organizational outcome, and then you can see the role training and a training intervention will play in achieving that organizational outcome. That's one of the things I really like about the CIPP model and the way it's implemented is it forces you to articulate a logic diagram. And logic diagrams aren't only associated to Stufflebeam, but he's the guy who kind of really put it on the map. But it forces you to think about that. What are the hard lines between training and organizational outcomes? And what other things do I have to measure? And what are the other consequences of training? Yeah, one of the benefits of that Acme rocket example I gave you in the report is that that group of executives ended up spending 2 weeks together, and most of them hadn't met each other for extensive periods of time. And it established lines of communication amongst a peer group that had none prior to that. That's an unintended consequence. Well, what are some things that might come from that? Better collaboration between divisions? Who knows? But that's what thinking about the logic diagram of a training intervention does for you, or a training program more generally. It makes you think about what are the short, mid, and long-term consequences. And it's not just we're better at sales. It's what are the other things we're doing with the learners or the participants in the program that might generate a benefit? Because that is not measured very well at all, because no one's going through the practice and putting that logic diagram.
Okay. So is that a skills gap? Is it a resourcing gap? Or is there something in those frameworks themselves that make it easy to stop early?
It's a fair question. I think it's an expectations gap more than anything else. The people asking the questions about training aren't necessarily professional program evaluators trained in a variety of methodologies. The people asked to perform the evaluations may be formally trained, may not be, but they're given a framework that they answer questions about. How many people went through training this month? What kind of training were they attending? What were the assessment outcomes? Whatever the data that's being asked of them. And so the people asking the questions or directing the answers have a certain level of expectation. I guess part of that is they haven't really been trained to expect more. But training is an expensive exercise. It's not just the cost of putting the training on, it's pulling people out of the workflow, sitting them down, and having them, share an instructional experience. Those costs of doing that need to be offset in a meaningful way by organizational outcomes. And to properly measure those organizational outcomes, you have to think about them and what they are. And then you can say, we're seeing an enhanced, outcome in this domain. And at least part of it is attributable to the fact that they spent 2 weeks in a conference room together, as an example. I think this is highly hypothetical, largely because I can't talk about the real name of Acme and that kind of thing. But what really spoke to me about that original example and what kind of drove the desire for this report is I was looking at a lot of the reporting paradigms in industry, and they were just woefully short of what could be accomplished with very minimal effort. You asked if it's a skills gap. It's not a skills gap. People aren't taking the time to, maybe that's a resource gap in the sense that they don't have time to do it. But if they spent some time thinking about formal evaluation, then we would know more answers to more questions. And as a consequence, answer what is the training really doing? Going back to that original statistic you cited, a vast majority of people feel the data they're reporting isn't telling the story it needs to tell. Well, the first step of that is figure out what data you need. and what story you want to tell, and then justify that story with a logic diagram.
Okay. And you're also careful to say learner feedback isn't the problem. Stopping there is. Where's the healthy line between engaged learner data is useful and where measuring what's easy instead of what matters?
So, in large population groups, large sample sizes, using what is called effective response data. So, very often this takes the form of a Likert type stem. The training was very useful for my job. It's a positive statement. And then you agree to it, and there's a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 7, whatever. Those types of questions are by definition self-declared, right? The learner, the participant, him or herself makes the decision how to answer that. And one person's 5 is not another person's 5, is not another. So there's some variance amongst individuals, but you get a big enough sample size together, and the research is pretty clear, and the statistics are very clear that the data is meaningful. But that's where people stop. And I'm going to make a fairly bold statement here. When it gets to effective response data, I don't really care as someone paying for training whether the learner liked it or not. What I care about is, am I achieving my organizational outcome? Now, I'm not, promoting the idea that we put on training that people loathe. What I'm saying is the data about the value of the training as declared by the learner has some value. Certainly someone working in some role for an extensive period of time has a very good idea of what their knowledge gaps are, or what they would like to know, or you know the relevancy of or the relevance of a training intervention for their job. That is very valuable. And that's what gets that engagement kind of discussion. Relevance, timeliness, those are very good measures as drawn from the participant. But when we get past that and we start talking in very broad strokes about the benefit or value of the training, a lot of program evaluators put those questions in effective response items posed to participants. I'm not sure they're positioned best to decide the value of the training for the organization. They're a great place to identify if it's of value to them, right? That goes to relevance and that kind of thing. But that's not the question that should be asked. The question the program evaluator should be asking is, what is the value to the organization? And that's not necessarily something you're going to ask to the participants, certainly not to the participants alone. You need to go find data sources beyond the participant population. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's easy to ask participants. They're kind of, you know, a captive audience. We're not going to break until you fill out this evaluation. Well, guess what? They're all going to fill it out. And that's what I mean by easy. But you need to go find those other data sources.
All right. Well, one thing that kind of struck me a little bit was in the research, you said 96% of structured training gets formally evaluated, but that drops to 29% for on the job training. Given how much real skill building happens on the job, what's the risk of that blind spot?
I think the biggest risks are that OJT is uneven. So as a consequence, organizations rely on, and you're exactly right, Jeff. OJT is probably the biggest pillar of workforce development and maintaining readiness and preparedness out there. We can have that discussion some other time, but it's certainly a big, big part of it. And if we don't measure it, we don't know what it's doing. And we might have expectations of OJT. Oh, it should take that individual about 4 months to get up to speed to do X, whatever X is, task, demonstrate, experience with, develop expertise in, whatever. If I don't know what is happening within the OJT, I haven't formalized milestones within that 4-month journey, as an example, then I have no way to know if I have two people, one who had an extraordinary OJT experience with a highly dedicated mentor or coach that was on them and, provided kind of a supervisory oversight in their development daily or weekly that they developed, were done in 3 months. Whereas an individual whose boss may or supervisor or whoever, is doing that kind of line supervisor, if they're not around as much, or maybe they're remote or hybrid or whatever, maybe they're not done at 6 months, maybe they're done at 8. And you would know that if you had milestones and you were looking at progress developments of individuals within that 4-month period. But it's only about one in three are doing that formally. And the companies, by the way, that in the interview section of the data collection for this report, they're doing it right. And by right with a capital R, they are collecting incredible data about new hire onboarding within job training and giving a lot of formative feedback to the individual so that they can identify where their shortfalls are and take action proactively before they get to the end of that, for example, 4-month period. They're doing it right, but it's just a lot of people aren't.
Well, all right. So practically, what would it even look like to evaluate on job training well, given how informal and unstructured it is by nature?
Well, 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, when manufacturing was, kind of the backbone upon which all work practices were based, the line supervisor was kind of the guy or gal that directed development of the individuals. And they got very good at discerning who is good at what and placed them in jobs where they'd be successful. And today, in an information centric economy, it is likely that that is less the case in many of those tasks. That's the bad news. The good news, though, is that we have a lot of artifacts that we can measure about someone's performance. Again, one of the practices for the people that we're doing OJT well is eliciting persistent feedback on a periodic basis, weekly, biweekly. One organization, called it something like, the Friday breakdown or something. And they would, you know, just aggregate that data and look at where people were. And the people that were starting to slip behind or accelerate, they'd go figure out why. And if it was someone who is excelling, they would try and sweep that change across everyone. And what they saw was that, you know, time to hire to time of proficiency, they reduced dramatically by tens of percent by just doing that, by asking for feedback. How's it going? But in a meaningful way against measures that someone had to sit down and think about, what do I expect a new hire to do in week 1? What do I expect them to be able to do in week 3 or week 5 or week 6 or month 5? And then write it down, get someone to say, yeah, that's about right, and then implement it. Again, it's a resource, right? It takes time to do that. It takes effort to do that. But the outcome of that is that attrition drops, and attrition, whether it's a training program or an organizational development problem, attrition costs an enormous amount of money. When you hire someone, just the process of getting them on board, and then they work for some period of time and it doesn't work out and they attrite by self-selection, or you have to fire them. That's a costly exercise, much more costly than the effort of giving them the tools to be successful. And I'm speaking in general terms. There are some people that aren't going to work out, and there are some people that are going to, you know, jump hurdles no matter what you throw at them. But if I just talked about generalities about the workforce, a well-prepared OJT program reduces attrition and gives people the tools to be successful within the organization to the benefit of both the individual and the organization.
All right. That kind of leads me to the next question here. You framed InSync's CIPP based approach as decision oriented rather than just reporting oriented. In plain terms, what What's the practical difference an executive would actually notice?
So a decision-oriented decision methodology or evaluation methodology is meant to provide information to a decision maker. And so to do that, you need to think about what questions or what decisions have to be made. So in this case, in a program evaluation approach relating to learning and development, what decisions have to be made about learning and development? The first one is, do we do it? Do we do it or not? What are we missing? Those kinds of things. And so a CIPP framework that's pushing that kind of data at a L&D decision maker is around those elements. How much are we spending on it? What are the organizational outcomes? What things aren't being delivered or, receiving attention that should? And what things that are currently being delivered that are really not doing what they should be doing? Again, all of those questions are, lead to a set of decision matrices against a logic diagram. And if a training intervention isn't accomplishing something, the first question is why. And if we get to that, training isn't relevant, or there's a process problem, or whatever they are. But you can't answer those questions. You can't answer that why unless you collect the data. And so that's what CIPP is about, trying to anticipate the kinds of questions an L&D program decision maker is going to be making about what to train on, how much to train on it, what are my regulatory requirements for training, and then implementing an evaluation model against those requirements such that when the question, the why, is asked, you already have the answer.
All right. So what I really would like to do is have you walk us through the logic model. The Acme rocket example ties training directly to organizational outcome. Can you explain that link in a way a non-researcher could follow? So basically saying a little bit less Harvard, more Boston.
So in that example, we were training on organizational behavior dynamics in Acme. And it was in anticipation of a reorganization that was going to split off a division of the company to make it a standalone, wholly owned subsidiary with its own leadership structure, its own, and it was a standalone company. It's still owned by Acme, but it was being spun off. And then that's a huge organizational change. Organizational behavior people will tell you, I'll summarize a lot of research. Change is hard and you have to prepare for it. And so what Acme did in anticipation of that spinoff is kind of get the team together that was going to be leading this wholly owned subsidiary and kind of give them the expected organizational response from individuals, teams, departments within a division that, why are we seeing productivity dropping here? Or why are we seeing, higher attrition here? And it's one thing to measure it and respond to it after the fact, but having us go through that training and actually think through all of these things in advance allowed us to identify what data we need to be looking at from day one. And so when one part of the division was struggling in their new role because now they didn't have oversight or accounting support from the bigger company, we knew it was going to happen and we anticipated it and we put in place things to prevent it from impacting the outcome of the reorganization. And as a consequence, attrition wasn't really affected. They expected attrition to be higher than it was. Is that meaningful? Well, we'll never know because we were proactive in addressing it. But taking those actions and going through that training and all those things, they armed the management and leadership team with tools and insights into what they needed to be looking at from day one. Instead of just relying on experience from, I was in another company that spun off a division and it's all anecdotal and it was a different economy then, it was a different product line, different industrial vertical, whatever. So, it was a great way to engender communication. And as a consequence, after that, when the company did spin off that division, the the meetings of senior leadership were dramatically effective because everyone was talking the same language. We all had the same experience of that training intervention to draw on to say, this is perhaps why this is happening. Let's take a look at, this data set to see why. And if that in fact is the cause, let's deal with it. And the conversations as a consequence were a lot less justifying action, whereas it was more like everyone was directed at trying to develop a solution because we had a common set of reference.
All right. Well, you mentioned that because training affects lag, organizations often need proxy variables, measurable stand-ins for outcomes that take years to show up. What's a proxy variable you've seen work well, and what's one that's a trap?
Great question. And the example I'll use will draw from a client I worked with. They were implementing training for their consumer audience. It was a software company, and it was a B2B relationship. So they'd sell this software platform to big businesses who would use the software tools to accomplish a variety of organizational tasks in the human resources domain. So the company was worried because they had what they called churn, which was of the 100 people that sign up for this platform and pay for an annual subscription in year one or your contract for year one, there's an out after 1 year in the contract, and then they have to stay in it for 3 or 5 years, whatever the number was. They were seeing a drop rate, a churn rate of about 1 in 3. So of 100 people that would sign up, about 33 would drop the platform after a year. And they're like, this is just costing us a huge amount of money. We got to fix this problem. What do you suggest? And so we looked at it. We looked at all the mechanisms. We did a lot of on-site interviews with users, both seasoned and new, did a lot of data reduction and kind of boiled it down. And we came up with this kind of training implementation kind of to be delivered to people as they were just opening the app for the first time. And it was meant to kind of walk them through it, answer questions. It was person moderated. It wasn't, just self-paced courseware or that kind of thing. And what we found was that churn dropped from about 33% to about 12%. Big, big number change. And what was also insightful is the rationale as to why the churn was happening, the feedback that you would get from someone as they were terminating, because salespeople during, when they're trying to recapture or retain clients, they'll ask all those kinds of questions. The qualitative feedback that people would give was not, I can't figure out how to use this to manage vacation time. I mean, it's too hard. Instead, it was, we found that it was really designed for an organization bigger than ours. And as a consequence, we didn't need it, was one of the kind of compelling pieces of feedback. But, I'm speaking in anecdotal, numbers here, but fractionally, churn went way down. And the rationale as to why it went down was not directed at, I don't know how to do stuff. It was more, this isn't really what we need right now. And that's a different discussion. That's a different organizational question. What product are we selling versus what do the organizations need? That's software engineering and, market research and that kind of thing. That's not training's job. But in that case, training accomplished the job it was meant to. And the way they knew that, Jeff, is they saw minute by minute who was clicking on what. They knew who was exposed to the training and who wasn't, and they could measure the difference between organizations that had taken advantage of the training and individuals within those organizations that had taken advantage of the training. And as a consequence, the retention was directly attributable, directly correlated to people who took advantage of the training. We can't make causal claims. Training saved 21%. That's not what we're saying. You can't say that. I'm not going out and doing all the things I'd need to do to make causal claims. But it was strongly suggestive that training accomplished what the organization wanted. And so we considered that a win.
So, how do you keep a team from just gaming the proxy instead of the outcome is supposed to represent
Well,
what the outcome is supposed to represent?
that kind of goes to you have to choose your proxies well. In this case, the proxy was actual usage of the application. I mean, you don't get more realistic data than that. If you don't know how to use the software, you don't know, you're going to put bad data into the system, but that's because you weren't trained to do it. No one is going to get trained and intentionally spoil the data set, probably. But what they will do is if they're trained and they're still having problems, now we have to look at other human factors. Why? Maybe it's an interface problem. Maybe we haven't designed the interface well. Maybe we haven't implemented it properly for that organization. But if the training stuck, in this case, the proxy was people actually doing the work. The actual desired outcome was a reduction of churn, right? We didn't know that for a year. But we had pretty compelling evidence after 2 or 3 months of delivery that that things were looking positive. We saw an uptake in the number of users within an organization as a fraction. We saw an uptick in the sophistication of the usage. They weren't just trying to do basic tasks. They were now trying to tailor what they were doing to the organizational need. And the reality is that in any big software package, when an organization adopts it, once it's adopted, it's really hard to dislodge because now it's tailored to how they're used to doing business. And that's what this company knew. And so as a consequence, they wanted to make sure the training was effectively delivered.
All right. Well, in closing, it's fascinating discussion, and I encourage everyone to download the report and really dig into it. But one last question for you, Chip. If a training leader is listening to this, walks away and does exactly one thing differently on Monday morning, what should it be?
Draw a logic diagram of your training program. Figure out what your short, medium, and long-term outcomes are. Figure out what they should be, and then identify the data sources you need to collect against and start collecting them. If you look at the proposed data model or the exemplar data model I give in the report, it talks about extrinsic to the organization, external factors that might affect outcomes. It talks about the required resources, both within and without the organization, the short, medium, who does what and how, as part of the logic diagram, and then the short, medium, and long-term outcomes. If you do those things and actually think about them, you'll develop a meaningful evaluation protocol that you can use a variety of methodologies. You can use Phillips, you can use KPIs, you can use Kirkpatrick, you can use whatever you want. But the logic diagram will tell you what data to collect and what you should expect to see, what needles you should be looking at in the cockpit as you're delivering training.
That's great. Well, again, always a great talking to you, Chip. This was really fascinating to read about and learn about what was going on with this research and how you came up with the conclusions that you did. Again, for everyone out there, please download the report. It's going to be in the show notes below. It will be coming out in September, so it'll come out in a week or so in September. And I want to thank everybody. If you like what we're doing today and you like seeing more about learning and development, please subscribe to our channel for regular updates and webinars that are coming up in the future. Also, for more modern learning on the air episodes, please give us a follow and you'll be up to date for everything. So thanks again. And Chip, thank you again for visiting with us today and talking with us. And we'll see you next time.
Chip, take care.
Thank you for tuning into Modern Learning on the Air. For all your training and services needs, visit us at insynctraining.com. And don't forget to sign up for our monthly webinars, where we cover key topics and trends in the learning and development space. Until next time, keep learning and keep growing.